Hey folks, happy Friday. After you finish the quiz for today, you'll be about a quarter done with the class. We're moving right along, and today we're on to Thanksgiving, an entirely mythological and invented tradition that's, I think, a lot of fun to dive into in a little bit more depth than we typically get. Today we're thinking about the nature of food traditions, the power of food myths, and how to reconcile myth versus history when it comes to food, invented versus real traditions, whether our participation in these kinds of food traditions, like Thanksgiving, matter. How America Eats, just 10 pages of that for today, gives us a very nice and succinct overview of early Thanksgivings, note the plural, a lot of basic historical background that will be very useful as you get into the other articles. The main courses for today, sorry for the food pun, but I do this to amuse myself as I sit in my empty office and record these. The main articles for today are the Deloria and Siskind articles. The Deloria piece, they're both called The Invention of Thanksgiving, so you can see what they're trying to communicate. The Deloria piece is a book review, so it's very short, about a book on the earliest Thanksgiving. Deloria explains and describes in a very short space the historical context and particularly how violent the time was. And he gives us much more complexity and nuance to the standard portrayals of Thanksgiving. One student last summer likened reading it to learning that Santa Claus doesn't exist. It's pretty short and self-contained, so I don't need to explain much more about it. The Siskind article is longer, not too bad, 25 pages, short pages. And there's a lot in there, and I just wanted to highlight a few things to prime you for as you get into it. What Siskind is really interested in is not just Thanksgiving, but food rituals and how they create or are meant to create a sense of history and shared identity. The stories we tell ourselves about the past for various reasons influence our sense of national identity and connectedness or separateness. And she's using Thanksgiving as a kind of case study. She wants us to think about the nature of ritual. And the goal of a ritual is a transformation of one state of being to another one, right? You're moving from one sort of existence to another one, however small or big that change might be. That's the point of a ritual. When the national holiday was created, Thanksgiving, in the 1860s, participation in this ritual was meant to transform a collection of immigrants. Immigration was increasing in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and moving forward, meant to transform a collection of this increasing numbers of immigrants into Americans by connecting them to a cultural history stretching back to the founding, right, of the country. When you start with the Siskind article, and if you get past the introduction, pay attention to the many kinds of Thanksgivings and the kinds of feast days that she describes. And note the highly religious function of the early Thanksgivings and the relationship between Thanksgivings and harvest festivals. Note the conflict between state and local pronouncements about what to celebrate and when. Lots of secular and religious disagreements about when you should eat, how much you should eat. Should it be a feast day or a fast day? When should it be? How do you celebrate this or do whatever you need to do? Lots of competing ideas about what a Thanksgiving, whether it's feasting or fasting, was actually about. Siskind calls Thanksgiving an invented tradition to create an imagined community, right? Making up this idea that there's this been consistent sort of feast over time to create this imagined community of Americans. One thing to be very clear about, invented traditions are invented for establishing or creating continuity with the past, not creating a break from it. You might just think from the term invented tradition that you're sort of deliberately trying to do something new. Well, there is an element of novelty in inventing something, but the point is to establish continuity with the past. Siskind is very provocative at the end of the article. She suggests that turkeys at the Thanksgiving table represent Native Americans, and our cooking and stuffing them represents our control and conquest over them. And I don't necessarily agree with that. It seems a little over the top for me. I don't know anyone who's ever thought that or expressed that idea. But we might easily agree that food can be very symbolic in general. And if that's true, what else would the turkey represent? And isn't it weird that we have the one standard? I mean, turkey, that's what you're supposed to have, right? A lot of people do different things, of course. But that's sort of the standard food, right? And what might it represent? So I don't really agree that it necessarily represents Native Americans, but it provokes contemplation about what Thanksgiving is really for. Why do we celebrate it? Almost everyone has a day off. We're doing stuff together. Many people, I think, just like the idea of having a feast to celebrate stuff they are thankful for in their lives. They're not thinking about pilgrims and Indians in the stereotypical way. They're not making the fake feather hats out of colored construction paper like we did in grade school. But does it matter that it's a national holiday? Even if you're not explicitly thinking about the stereotypical imagery, does it matter that it's a national holiday that we're all sort of engaged in one way or the other, even if we're trying to avoid it? Still, it's the national holiday. Is it really about thankfulness, or is it about fostering a mythic sense of togetherness because we're all doing it at the same time or dealing with it in one way or the other? One very provocative point that she makes toward the end that really made me rethink my own ideas about Thanksgiving was to suggest that one function of keeping the national holiday in place, even if people don't think about the stereotypical imagery, is to glaze over the actual history between the English settler colonials and Native Americans, both in the 1600s, early Thanksgivings, but also through the late 1800s, when Thanksgiving was becoming more of a sort of a standard thing that people were doing. Is this a way of glazing over the brutal policies of American government towards Native Americans? For Siskind, facilitating harmony is a crucial function of the holiday, even if we don't think about it explicitly. Whatever you do, whatever you think about, whatever you talk about, maybe facilitating harmony is part of the reason we continue to do it. And along those lines, she calls attention to something I never thought about before reading this, the role of Thanksgiving in the ritual of the year. Late October, Halloween, great holiday, pumpkins everywhere. What do they represent? Fear, chaos, disorder. We put fire in them. It's kind of scary. And then 3 weeks later, pumpkins are the symbols of harmony and sweetness at the end of our Thanksgiving meal. And that transformation, right, that ritual of making that pumpkin nice, is that part of what that Thanksgiving ritual and tradition, however invented and mythological it may be, is that part of why we keep it around? So Siskind is very helpful in getting us to think about the many layers and meanings of Thanksgiving and how it's changed over time. Clearly, there's no such thing as an authentic Thanksgiving. A couple broader points to keep in mind as you go through the set of readings. If you participate in a food tradition, invented or real, are you therefore reaffirming the history and the reasons behind that tradition, even the fictionalized ones? The last reading is about the likely Thanksgiving menu. And the article is exactly what Haley told us not to do in terms of history. It's all about recreating the menu, trying to figure out what the original foods were. Nothing about the actual history that you got in the other articles for today. I'm asking you to read it last because it's really kind of striking to read through what Thanksgiving is actually about and then get to this sort of first menu article. Zero historical context about the idea of Thanksgiving. The word conflict does not appear. Religious festival, harvest festival, nothing about these. After you read these other two articles about the actual history of Thanksgiving, it's hard to see this article as anything but reaffirming the values that the traditional food of Thanksgiving is meant to symbolize. Togetherness, harmony, nostalgia, a romantic view of the past. It seems to presume the food is just as important as knowing the history of the tradition, as if knowing the actual menu would make the holiday more authentic in a way. Standard reading quiz for today should be very straightforward. Also plenty of short answer questions as well, including some extra credit ones where you can describe a little bit more about your own meanings behind your Thanksgiving traditions. I love reading those. And I'd love to hear how you think about your own traditions in light of these readings. No video on Monday, so you get a 3-day break from these videos. I'll see you on Tuesday. Have a great weekend.